where the smooth animation magic happens within After Effects, the graph editor, one of the most important parts, together with the keyframes, of course, for doing great animations within After Effects. Let us start off here with the very basics. So going into a just pre-made comp I made earlier, a graph editor main comp, and then into the linear path. Let's opening up to show the keyframes in the layer, pressing U on the keyboard, and this will expose all the keyframes and currently this position animation. An important thing to understand here, whenever we are talking about the speed graph, the graph editor, and when we are talking about keyframes overall, it's a type of interpolation. And interpolation, Adobe explains it as the very process of filling in the unknown data between two known values of data. In this very specific case, the two known specified values are the two different keyframes set up here in the composition. One to the left, where the green box is currently at, while the other one to the very right and represented by the smaller blue box or cube, if you will. The dotted line in between here is part of the interpolation process, whereas After Effects have filled out that unknown data between those values or the keyframes. The interpolation can then further be broken down to a few different type of methods that help manipulate or change that type of unknown value in the middle between those two known values or keyframes. And they're also connected to the temporal, as in time, and the spatial, as in space or position, type of interpolation. These two different type of interpolations. The spatial interpolation, it's represented by the whole blue line to about where the space in the green box will move to, while instead the temporal interpolation is kinda all these small little blue dots on that same line. So if temporarily deleting the last keyframe here, we can see that the dots becomes further apart. And thus we're speeding up the whole moment here, as it need to reach that same point at within a shorter span of time. If we would do the opposite instead and actually dragging out the keyframe, there will be more dots added and instead will be slowing down the whole movement. As this is a linear path with linear keyframes, all the dots will have the same distance and thus also moving with the same speed. But if I were to press the F9 to add some easing to it, we'll be seeing the dots a lot further apart in the middle and closer in the very beginning, meaning we have now changed the temporal interpolation to start slower and then speed up against the very middle and slow down again against the very end. Now, if I undo this again, then let's see them together instead in the main comp. And let's add one of the ease in here to show. Thus, this one will instead be easing or slowing down into each of the keyframe. And the opposite effect will happen if you choose the ease out, as the easing will go out smoothly from the keyframe and really fast into, or at least faster into the next one. Thereby we're changing between different type of methods between the temporal interpolation or the timing interpolation, only affecting the movement between the keyframe, but still arriving at the keyframes at the very same time. And the spatial interpolation stays the same. If I then going into the EC's comp, the spatial interpolation might be changed here by, for example, either dragging the keyframe in the composition a bit closer or further apart, or just to a completely new location. But we're also able to change the whole path and bend it using the pen tool. So just by pressing and dragging over the keyframe, creating a Bezier curve as a form of the Bezier interpolation, and counted as pretty much the whole base for all interpolation in After Effects. But let's undo this, plus change the comp again to speed graph now. And finally, armed with this knowledge, let's actually dig into that graph editor. When entering the graph editor, there are two different graphs. This one, the speed graph, which is the default one for all the spatial properties, for example as position, and then the value graph, it's a default for all the temporal properties, just as the opacity property. And let's start off with the very first one. So up at the top, everything will be the same as normal. So just what to be aware of is the numbers to the left here on the vertical axis. This will be ranging from 0 in the very bottom and up to 2500 pixels per second. Then these two curves, as two mountains if you will, or just whatever you might happen to imagine them as, indicate by what speed the animation is moving at by a current time frame. So in the very beginning at 0 seconds, we're standing still and moving with 0 pixel per second. But around half a second, we're moving at our fastest peak of more than 2000 pixels per second. This can also be seen in the temporal interpolation, where the blue dots are placed tighter in the very beginning when the speed is also a bit lower, but gradually they're spreading out a bit more as reaching the very peak of the curve or of our mountain. Descending fast in the beginning, but becomes a little bit tired and slow down at the bottom valley, and then stopping completely. To view the difference between the linear keyframes, we can just go out of the graph editor. Let's mark the keyframes while holding either Control if you're on a PC or Command if you're on a Mac. And this will be turning them linear, thus giving us this flat graph with an even speed of roughly 1500 pixels per second from the very start to the end. But let's undo this as well. And now the interesting and so valuable thing with the graph editor is that we can have optimal or full control of the spatial and the temporal interpolation for each keyframes. There's this little line connected to it with a small yellow circle or dot at the very end. By marking all keyframes, we're able to use the handle on the left to influence the velocity or the speed by anything from 0 to 100%, whereas 100% being fully dragged out in the middle of the two keyframes, and giving this kind of snappy motion with a slow start, a big speed ramp, then a bit of slowing down again. While we can also further see this by right-clicking the keyframe, choosing keyframe velocity, showing the keyframe type as in which specific keyframe and at what time. We got incoming and outgoing velocity, plus we're also able to directly influence it by value numbers in pixels per second, its percentage, and also add a continuous or lock outgoing to incoming, meaning it will lock the speed between them two, but it won't affect the actual influence. This is a handy one for changing the base points of the keyframes. For example, if changing the spatial interpolation again and curving the path, seeing the animation kind of come to a stop at the second keyframe, By raising the base point of the keyframe, we kind of keep the movement going the whole time, and it's just slowing down, but it's not coming to a full or to a complete stop. Thereby, we're actually changing the temporal interpolation from Bezier to continuous Bezier, and we're changing the spatial interpolation from just a simple linear to actually also continuous Bezier. That might sound a little bit confusing, but I will show you. So if I right-click the keyframe again, but now choosing the keyframe interpolation, both the temporal, as in property changes over time, the blue dots, and then the spatial interpolation, as in the shape of the path, the blue lines or path we just curved, and have now turned continuous Bezier. Thereby the two yellow handles on the keyframe are now connected and move continuously or at the same time. So let's undo this, and suddenly the temporal interpolation is just Bezier, while we can now move the two handles individually and they're not connected anymore. And go back to keyframe interpolation once again, and thereby the spatial interpolation is linear, as in moving in a straight line. So picking up the pen tool, then holding Alt or Option while dragging out the keyframe handle to the very top, this will change just the outcoming spatial interpolation. Thus, inside the keyframe interpolation, we have now changed the spatial from linear to Bezier. And another option and interpolation is the auto Bezier. For this one, let's delete the third keyframe and turn these two into linear, while adding a new keyframe in the very middle here. Just dragging up the position a little bit. By dragging out the right linear keyframe, only the right side of the path or the temporal interpolation is now affected. Though by turning the middle keyframe into an auto Bezier keyframe, holding Ctrl or Command again while pressing it, the timing will now change and kinda smoothen out even for the left path, so as when the same keyframe is being moved. To change the spatial interpolation, you can just choose the pen tool and click on the keyframe, and it will automatically smoothen out to now a spatial curve instead. Now just hold on a little bit more for the last keyframe, and we're stopping into the hold. And this keyframe will hold or stop any type of movement until the keyframe afterward. So as we can see, it's making the green box jump directly from the second to the third keyframe now instead. Let's toggle hold keyframe. And we're at the last option here, the rove. And it's kind of smoothing out the speed graph, which currently is at lock to time. But swapping to rove across time, they will spread out just like a linear temporal interpolation. That's pretty much the basics of the speed graph and keyframes within After Effects. Next, I will be showing just a little bit about the interface or the panel icons within the graph editor, and then we're heading over to the value graph and checking out that one as well. On the eye icon down to the very left, we're finding the show selected properties, and this is showing us the graph only when the actual property is marked or selected. By ticking the show animated properties, as long as the layer is selected, we will see the curves of it, and throwing in another animation as well will be revealing them both at the same time. With only the last alternative selected, the Show Graph Editor set, by taking this little icon between the stopwatch and the property name, we kinda include this property in the Graph Editor set, and thus only bringing out those ones. By choosing the auto-select graph type, After Effects will kinda choose or default back to that type of graph it think is the best or most suitable for whatever type of property you're currently animating. Edit value graph I will come back to soon, and then back again to the speed graph. With show reference graph, the opposite graph to what we're currently in will show up as a kind of reference, with its values being on the very right vertical axis. If I add a music track and smash the show audio waveforms, it's a little bit easier to see where to directly put any keyframes for audio levels, plus directly adjust the curves if needed. The show layer in and out points introduce these bracket or arrow looking icons at the beginning and end of the layer, which might be just a little bit clearer if I actually drag in the layer start and stop just a bit. It's just making it somewhat easier and quicker to navigate around inside the graph editor. By adding a marker to the layer, choosing the option show layer markers, it's letting us see all those markers on the graph or curve. Show graph tool tips is this little box popping up when hovering over the curve. Plus, we can choose to directly show expression editor in the bottom of the graph editor, while also allow keyframes between frames for even greater detail timing. But if we're actually going out of the graph editor, it won't be possible anymore to, as it would just move frame by frame. A really nice handy tool for whenever you are doing those really fine-tuning or almost micro animations, if you will, where you need to go into specific details, then this might be a nice option to have that control. Then the next icon, we kind of got an outline cube with some more cubes attached to it, as in show a transform box when multiple keys are selected, and this kind of lighter highlighter area in the bottom. With a magnet icon called snap turned on, keyframes snap or glue onto different type of important or focused areas in the graph, like the current time indicator with the keyframe values, times, and indicated by this orange line turning up. We then got the auto zoom graph height, and it lets the panel adjust automatically when turned on if the graph, for example, peak above the current top. With the two graph icons on the left, we might toggle visibility while either focusing on just one of the keyframes with the left icon, or we might also zooming out for all of them on the right one. Next one here is just a really handy one when we are coming in for the next graph, the value graph. The separate dimensions kind of splits position values in X, Y, plus the set one if we're actually turning on the 3D space as well. Marking the keyframe in the middle and smash this icon with a little diamond shape and small arrow down called Edit Selected Keyframes. We can now see and may animate the specific values in all type of dimensions, plus able to choose what type of units to display it in. Under the edit value, we're getting the same alternative as just we saw above. Go to keyframe time, pushes the current time indicator to that marked keyframe. Just as with the layers, it's also possible to label and organize any type of keyframes a bit dependent on on the color. And I will label these two keyframes red. And by choosing select keyframe label group, open up to select those red label keyframes on select layers or on all layers. For example, if you might be working on multiple layers and the keyframes there are grouped together and you want to have them animated together. Or we also got the same options, but specifically for only those keyframes visible in the actual timeline. Then with two or more identical keyframes, like a copy of the one in the middle, there's this way to select all the equal keyframes. Let's rewind or undo this, and the next option will be select previous keyframes or following keyframes. There are a few different icons to quickly change between a different type of default keyframes. So by highlighting them all, we got a bit of option that we're able to convert them to either to whole, we can go back again to linear, and perhaps we want to turn them into out to Bezier, the easy ease, the easy ease in, or the easy ease out. And finally, we're moving into the value graph. And everyone might have their favorites of the two different graphs in After Effects, and mine is actually the speed graph, but at the same time I would never rule out one graph over the other one, because there was always animations that might be preferable in the speed graph, while other type of animations will be preferable in the actual value graph. So it's just a good rule of thumb to have a bit of an open mind within these two type of graphs and not ruling out one over the other. So use them both and try to be a little bit more flexible, and you will have greater access to make better animations. But now, actually going into the value graph, let's go to the value graph box composition. And I created this, very classic jumping ball movement, but twisted it slightly, if you will, with a box. So the most obvious pattern with this animation is for the Y position, the vertical movement. And as we're watching the graph curve in the value graph, it's more or less a complete replication of the path in the composition, but if you actually are flipping it upside down. This is one of those really clear examples where I actually prefer the value graph over the speed graph any day, because it just makes so much more sense and is more visual, logical, if you will, to use this type of animations with the value graph instead of the speed graph. And if we're actually turning over to the speed graph to have a look on the same motion, it might just be a little bit tougher to actually recreate or create this type of motion. Taking us to how this ball actually moves in a type of curved line forward, the Disney's seventh principle, the arc, movements kind of following a curved path rather than straight lines for creating a bit more natural type of movement. In the value graph, instead of using the pixels per second over time as with the speed graph, now presented with a vertical axis showing only the pixels and how that value changes over time. And I'm currently working in a standard 1920 1080 pixel composition, and that's exactly what the values in the value graph will be showing and representing now. So my starting point for the box is at 0 pixels, as it's at the very top of the composition. And then hitting the bottom close to 1080 pixels, because it's moved through the whole vertical of the composition. Similar to the X position or the horizontal movement, starting a bit under the 0 pixels since we're actually outside the actual composition. But moving forward in with the current time indicator, the box kind of moves to the right with the curve going higher or closing in on the 920 pixels as the maximum value of the composition. Just similar like in the speed graph, we're having the same type of handles to be able to adjust the curves with. Moreover, we're serving a bit of scaling to this and showing the values of scaling, the red X horizontal and the green Y vertical separately as overlapping to give a bit of a squash and stretch look. By turning the layer into 3D space, we're also adding a blue line for the set position or the depth to control as well in 3 different type of separate dimensions together. And yeah, that was actually it for the graph editor and the keyframes in After Effects. And perhaps it's a little bit tough one and a bit complicated at times, especially in the beginning, but hopefully it gave you some value here and a little bit of clarification and some hope perhaps. So hopefully setting you up for some really nice animations in the very future.